After the fall of man and being banished from Eden in chapter 3, chapter 4 begins with Adam and Eve fulfilling God's command to be fruitful and multiply. They eventually give birth to a son who they name Cain, which loosely means, I have him. This was sort of like Adam and Eve's way of acknowledging that Cain was now their responsibility. After Cain's birth, Eve declares, I have a man from the Lord. There are a few reasons why she may have said this. Perhaps Eve was humbling herself and admitting that God was the source of her blessing. Or it also could be that Eve thought that Cain was the Messiah that God had promised in Genesis 3:15. Ironically, rather than being the promised seed they were expecting, Cain would instead become the first murderer. After the birth of Cain, Adam and Eve gave birth to another son, who they named Abel. Both Cain and Abel practiced different trades, with Cain working in agriculture and Abel with livestock. Over some time, Cain and Abel gave an offering to God. The Bible says that Abel offered some of the best parts of the firstborn lambs of his flock, while Cain offered up some of his crops. God looked upon Abel with favor, but did not show favor to Cain and his offering. This made Cain very upset. God then responded to Cain's anger by essentially saying, Why are you so upset? You know that if you do this correctly, then you'll be accepted. God then warns Cain, saying that if he doesn't do well, then sin lies at the door and will try to devour him. But instead, Cain should rule over his sin. Of course, this warning sort of foreshadows Cain's decision to allow sin to overcome him and eventually kill his brother. Now let's pause for a moment, because there's a lot to unpack here. There are several things to notice at this point in the story. First of all, it's very likely that the reason Cain and Abel were providing an offering to the Lord in this chapter was because God was trying to teach them the importance of giving offering, and also to show them what is considered to be a good offering that atones for your sin, which of course is a blood sacrifice. This would explain why God uses the offerings as a teachable moment for Cain in verse 6, where God implies that Cain already knows that he will be accepted if he does well, and to be careful when not doing well, because that allows sin to creep into his life. In other words, Cain probably already knew that his crops were not going to be a sufficient offering, but just did it anyway. Also, it's worth noting that the Bible says Abel gave the very best parts of his lamb offering to the Lord, while not really specifying that Cain's crops were anything special. So not only did Cain fail to provide a sufficient offering as atonement for his sins, he also probably just gathered a few crops he already had on hand without putting much thought into it. That's not exactly what you would want to do when giving an offering to God. Okay, so now back to the story. Cain was very upset at God's refusal to accept his offering, so he decides to invite his brother to talk in the fields, where he then proceeds to murder him. Yeah, I know, that escalated quickly. It's worth noting here that although no human had ever been murdered before, we do know from Abel's lamb offering that humans, at the very least at that time, knew how to kill animals. So it's most likely that Cain probably murdered Abel based on how he saw animals were killed for sacrifice. But the Bible doesn't say this specifically. After the murder, God questions Cain and asks him if he knows where Abel is. Of course, God already knew at this point what Cain had done to Abel because, after all, he is God. However, God probably asked Cain where his brother was so that he can give Cain a chance to confess his sin. But instead of confessing his sin, Cain plays dumb. He answers arrogantly, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? This was another way of him saying, how should I know? Am I responsible for Abel? God then reveals that he already knows that Cain killed Abel. And then God cursed Cain by declaring that from here on out, it'll be nearly impossible for Cain to work the ground. God also said that now Cain will have to roam the earth as a vagabond for the rest of his life. Instead of humbling himself and feeling remorse, Cain began to complain about this, saying that God's punishment was too harsh and that it put him at great risk of death because now he'll have to wander the earth for the rest of his life and could be murdered by somebody else along the way. Then God responds with mercy, saying that if anybody does murder Cain, that vengeance will be taken on that person sevenfold. He then put a mark on Cain that served as a warning to anybody who tried to kill him. The Bible never specifies what type of mark this was or how exactly anybody would know that Cain was protected by looking at the mark. What do you think the mark was? Let me know in the comments down below. So, the next section of this chapter talks about what happens after the story of Cain and Abel, where Cain begins to have a family. The Bible says that Cain began his vagabond life by living in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. There, Cain found a wife and had a child who they named Enoch. After this, they built a city, which they named after their son. Then, the Bible talks about different generations of family that came after Cain, until we finally reach one of his descendants named Lamech. Lamech, who was Cain's great-great-great-grandson, married 2 wives, which is actually the Bible's first mention of polygamy. With these 2 wives, Lamech had children, and these children had other children, who began to experiment with innovation. One of these families dwelled in tents and had livestock, another family played the harp and the flute, and another crafted bronze and iron. The Bible then includes a passage where Lamech arrogantly brags about himself to his wives, saying that he once killed a man who had hurt him, and that if Cain was supposed to be avenged 7-fold if he was murdered, then Lamech should be avenged 70-fold if he was murdered. This was Lamech's way of comparing himself to Cain and sort of suggesting that the sins of Cain were nothing compared to the sins of Lamech. Chapter 4 ends by shifting back to Adam and Eve and describes a new son that is given to them, who they name Seth. Ironically, it would be this son who would be the one to usher in the promised seed spoken of in Genesis 3:15, who Eve originally thought was supposed to be Cain. The chapter ends with Seth having a son named Enosh and explaining that men began to call on the name of the Lord. Okay, so let's be clear. This is a very popular story in the Bible, and when reading this chapter, most people like to focus on the more popular lessons here, like the first act of murder in the Bible, or how Cain was an evil and selfish person, or how vengeance and jealousy is bad. But the truth is that there is a lot more than we can take from this chapter. So although Genesis chapter 4 is jam-packed with a bunch of important things for us to learn, I want to focus on giving you 3 unique takeaways from this chapter that you may not always hear about when reading this chapter or listening to a sermon about Cain and Abel. In the future, I plan on doing other videos that go more in depth about Cain and Abel, so make sure to click the subscribe button so you don't miss them. Okay, so the first takeaway I want to talk about in this chapter is the demoralization of humanity, which escalates really quickly after the fall of man. In this chapter alone, we see the first murder, the first case of polygamy, and the first instance where humans knowingly reject the fear of the Lord. Even Adam and Eve were afraid of God when he approached them about their sin, but both Cain and Lamech arrogantly defied God. Cain showed sarcasm when God asked him about Abel and complained about his punishment while showing no remorse for murdering his brother. Lamech also killed a man with no remorse and arrogantly bragged that God should have given him more mercy and protection than he even gave Cain. While reading this chapter, it's very clear that after the fall of man, humanity begins to demoralize very, very quickly. The second takeaway that is often overlooked when reading this chapter is the urbanization and innovation that begins to take shape in society for the first time in our history. In verse 17, the text says that Cain eventually built an entire city, which is really the first city that the Bible says is built by humans. Also, this is very easy to miss, but verses 20 to 22 briefly describe some of Lamech's offspring and their innovative skills. These descendants were able to craft and live in tents, play string and pipe instruments, and even forge tools out of bronze and iron. So in the previous chapter, we go from Adam and Eve struggling to learn how to fend for themselves to the next chapter where their offspring is building entire cities, making tents, playing music, and crafting tools. Although the Bible doesn't go into detail explaining exactly how they were able to attain these skills, It's the urbanization and innovation that humans began to experiment with here that's important, because humans had no choice but to become innovative creatures now that God was no longer meeting their needs in the same way that he was when they were living in the Garden of Eden. And the final takeaway from this chapter that we'll talk about today is a much more positive one, and it's found in the final sentence, which reads, "At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord." Despite the wickedness and evil that was starting to run rampant throughout the earth, Seth and his offspring turned back to God. In a way, this was the very first spiritual revival that we ever saw in the history of mankind. And as we will see time and time again, God will always intercede for those who remain faithful to him. In fact, one of Seth's very own descendants will remain so faithful to the Lord in a time when no one else was, that he will be used to usher in a new era in our history, which is what we will be covering in the next few chapters. Hi everyone, thanks for sticking around to the end, and if you found any value in this video, please consider clicking the like and subscribe button so that way you can keep up to date with all the work we're doing here at What's the Word. Also, please consider leaving a comment down below, or even sharing this video with others. Who knows, maybe it'll be a blessing to someone you know. Anyway, thanks for sticking around to the end, thanks for watching this video, I appreciate every single one of you, God bless, and I'll see you in the next one.